Oh.
Okay, I think we're live. So we'll give it just a minute before we start. Okay. All right, so 1 minute past, might as well get started. So hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar. Our focus is going to be on beyond the bottom line, quantifying and qualifying the impact of L&D with the ultimate goal to build up a business case or be able to quantify ROI in the business case which you have put forward or identified where you would like to solve a problem. This recording will be available to everybody, so those who are perhaps jumping in a little bit later, we'll remind you that it is available. You can back around to it. So we'll get straight into things. So my name is Dieter Doyer. I am Head of Technology Innovation at Vitro Global. I'm thrilled to have with us today Michael O'Neill, who's part of Blossom as well, very much focused in the learning technology space. So thank you for joining us today. We're quite excited to explore this as a subject. It can be a bit of a testing subject. We do help a lot of clients in this space very often to translate that into actionable strategies, measuring true impact of L&D, and making sure that it hits the mark and you're able to sort of actually get into the process of delivering your solution which you have in mind. We all know that L&D investments or HR investments are critical in shaping organizations' future. And today we're focusing on how we build that compelling case, securing the support and the resources needed to drive that success. So whether you're looking to enhance your current technology, add on to existing systems, completely overhaul your approach, this will hopefully provide you guys with some valuable insight. So like I said, I'm joined by Michael, a co-host from Blossom, leader in learning management for mostly focusing on SMA and mid-market sort of space. Michael brings great deep experience in organization leveraging technology for impactful learning. So Michael, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here today, Dieter. Pleasure to be joining you, and also to everybody listening and watching in. I basically am the strategic partnership manager over at Blossom. We have been around about 17 years now. You may not have heard of us because we are, in the past 6 months, we've been looking to make a foothold in the UK. I should mention we are an LMS LXP vendor. That is our area. And so, yeah, I just thought I'd kind of maybe bring some insights today, if I can, into the experience that I have with trying to help people build their business case. In my experience, of course, for implementing a new LMS. So I will be kind of referencing things from a frame for that when I'm actually discussing the meat and potatoes of the actual presentation today. But yeah, that's it for myself for now. Maybe you want to go through some of the housekeeping, Dieter?
Yes, indeed. So, like I mentioned, a couple of housekeeping tools. We've got an amazing platform over here, which we're all a big fan of. It should last around about 45 minutes, but we do also have a Q&A, and we'd like to get to that as quickly as possible. And that's with our CEO, Michael Horling, CEO of Vitro Global, incredibly experienced in the space, especially with big enterprise case, and often translate into which often translate into millions of pounds of value. So stick around if you have any questions during the presentation. Feel free to add that into the chat as well, and we'll do our best to get around to address those either during the session or at the end of the session with Mike. Like I said, recording is available, but we'll also be sending out some resources off the back of this as well. So from our perspective in Vitro, we'll be sending off some practical tools, which include templates, which again, I think might be of some value, where we've seen have translated into successful business cases. So those most probably will be helpful, including metrics. So how do you quantify the value? I think it's the thing which is key to that. So Michael, if you want to go through quickly our agenda, and then we'll get straight into the detail.
Yep. So first and foremost, Dieter is going to be looking at the importance of defining the actual business problem itself. He's going to take a look at the stats on what the biggest issues are and actually defining the issues through the lens of the impact they have and the value that they actually bring to the table, which at that point I will be looking at the second topic, which is the process for building the business case, the things you need to consider there. We're going to be looking at quantifying value, productivity, the cost of ownership, implementation costs, the cost of doing nothing or standing still, who your influencers and your decision makers are, and how to actually present that case and what to consider. Then Dieter we'll move to the Q&A and we'll introduce my colleague, and then we will wrap it up and be sure to send all the resources out to everybody. So on that note, Dieter, over to you.
No, brilliant, thank you. So first subject which we've got as part of today's conversation is the importance of defining the business problem. So I know I use the term problem. I know a lot of methodologies in terms of continuous improvement prefer not to use the term problem. So I am using it very much as a catch-all, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a problem. It could be something which you're proactively striving for and doesn't represent a problem today, but potentially could represent a blocker in the future. So one of the things which I think is incredibly important is about in terms of defining the problem, is about understanding the context. So we were lucky enough to join Cornerstone with a recent Galaxy launch as well. And one of the things which was mentioned on there was the fact that actually we all suffer from very similar problems in our trade and in our industry, whether it be strategic workforce management or whether it be we want to get to driving skills and capabilities or closing gaps. But our context is very different. And equally, when we're talking about business case development and ROI, the context to that business case creation and ROI is going to be very different. So what do I mean by this? It might be that actually your issues which you're facing into and you're trying to resolve through creation of a business problem and investment in those issues could be something really straightforward. But one of the things which we'll come on to and we talk a little bit more about in the in the Q&A later on is how it doesn't necessarily always land, or you don't necessarily always have the opportunity to be able to explore that because you haven't pitched it correctly. So I'll give you a couple of examples. As a HR director, struggling to optimize with outdated, semi-automated systems leading to inefficiencies and errors, that's kind of their sort of space. CHRO, however, is going to be looking at things slightly more strategically. So making links between workforce capability and business goals and seeing where they're able to sort of mobilize the right capability to be able to achieve business goals. An L&D manager might be looking at it to say their learning management system is not delivering personalized content, or perhaps even they are achieving amazing content consumption, perhaps around the sort of 17%. They'll be looking at it and going, okay, well, does that mean that 83% is not being consumed? So is that really good value for money? So again, they're going to be looking at things far more tactically. Another example, which we come across quite often, talent acquisition manager, poor systems integrations between, sort of results in inefficient recruitment processes. And then ultimately issues in being able to address those skills gaps. So all of those things are really important to consider, because when we're looking at the importance of defining the business problem when going through the business case, one of the things which we'll look at is who our audience is and whether or not we're able to pitch that to the right level. So where does your decision makers go? So that I think is a really good starting position. So for those who are listening to this, when you're going into that situation, just be aware that your context might be very different to your audience's context. So one of the things which Michael will talk about a little bit later on is in terms of your decision-making unit, and how important it is to define that in terms of understanding how it is that you go about messaging your business case. So what kind of things really bring this to light? So from our experience, we move on to the next subject, which is going to be around statistics. Everybody loves great statistic. And if you haven't understood your audience in the business problem, in the context of the audience, you then have you might not necessarily have the ability to be able to really drive that point home, because you will be providing statistics and data which is not relevant to that audience. So again, another simple example, L&D manager, 40% of organizations report they're not able to provide effective tracking of employee sort of gaps and skills. Or the transition, I think, which is a common conversation piece at the moment around skills-based model. How do you actually go about creating a skills-based model? So statistically, the benefits which you're going to gain from that, if we're talking about a skills-based organization, perhaps to a technologist, which is sitting there managing and administrating the system, we might not necessarily be hitting the mark. So considerate of all of those, you're then able to sort of really think about how it is your business problem identification is defined. So are you able to define that business problem in the right context for the right audience? Ultimately, the reason why we talk about these things is because when it comes to the actual tactical tasks of doing, i.e. implementing a change, implementing a new system, that's a process. And that follows a really simple linear track. And that actually we find is the slightly easier part of things. But if you're not able to define that as to where the value lies, or solve potentially the wrong problem to the wrong audience, that's where things start to fall apart. So for a starting point, again, just in terms of the introduction to this, defining your problem, really important. Solving the right problem, being very clear about what it is that you want in terms of outcomes. Understanding your audience, and then making sure that you have the right information to be able to support that is the key part to this entire process. And that's very much about the communications of the business case. So Michael, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what we've just discussed and where we've gone through, and whether or not any of that resonates with your world and where you work.
I mean, that's pretty much a daily conflict that I find, is that people, they don't know how to sell to their individual audience. A chief financial officer is going to ask, how is this going to affect top line and bottom line? Your HR manager is going to ask, how is this going to help compliance? Everybody's asking, what's in it for me? And it just comes down to sales 101 and negotiations, which is you have to give somebody a reason to want what you're suggesting. If it's a new LMS or training or an in-house apprenticeship program, whatever the case may be, if you have to identify, touching on this later myself, the decision-making unit, who's actually influencing, who's actually decision-making here, and what do they want, what's in it for them, and how do I sell this to them? I face that very, very commonly where, I'm speaking to somebody, for example, and they want a new LMS for whatever reason, and, it falls down when they actually have to go and make that case. So to answer your question, yes, I experienced that quite a bit.
Yeah. Okay, cool. No, so I think that's a really good context piece. And like I said, we're all facing very similar problems in this industry. And the context is going to be very different. So making sure that we're able to identify the business problem, get that senior leadership stakeholder buy-in, and then secure budget does come a lot down to how it is that business case is constructed. And it's equally important as what it is that you're going to be doing in terms of business case. So that leads us very nicely onto the construction of the business case. So the things which, Michael, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about in your experience in constructing a business case and what has worked in the past will include things like the qualifying values and looking at ROI. So I'll hand over to you to continue the conversation.
Perfect. Great. So yeah, I mean, first and foremost, looking at quantifying actual value, it really comes down to this mindset of cost versus value. So to take a perfect example, let's say, I don't know, you're a company of 2,000 people, you want a new LMS, you've got budget, you're looking at, let's say, 30 grand a year, whatever it is. It's very easy to quantify those things, the ongoing cost, the implementation fee, the annual license fee, or fees for e-learning, whatever that is. decision makers tend to only look at it through the cost and not the value. And it comes down to looking at what the top line is of a company versus the bottom line. And most people only ever look at the bottom line. How do I cut costs instead of looking at how do I invest in my people and make money? You know, like I think it was a Gallup poll that was done not too long ago, and millennials, the second largest reason they leave a company is for a lack of opportunities to advance themselves. So it can be difficult to quantify, but if you look at, you know, the ongoing effects of that, which are, you know, you lose staff, you lose reputation, you lose morale, you lose knowledge, you lose all these things that can't really be put down in a number. They can only really be put down at the top line, we'll say. So those are all things. When the bottom line there is when you're presenting that case and you're building it, always try to look at things through a value mindset as opposed to what is the actual cost of this. Second point, as we said, really is that decision-making unit. Influencers versus decision makers. Typically, your decision makers are going to be people like your CEO, chief financial officer, head of learning, people, culture, potentially IT personnel. And like we said before, everybody's going to have a different angle. What's in it for them? How do I need to tailor my pitch to each individual person? And how do I actually get that value across them? And like you said, Peter, it's going to massively change based on each individual person. So really just comes down to tailoring it to your audience, as I said previously. Coming back, maybe like a couple of interesting facts, like 41% of L&D professionals expect to have more spending power in 2025, which is promising. Global L&D investment is, you know, $315 billion by 2025. So yeah, those are nice statistics to say that companies are starting to catch on and they're starting to see the value in it. That's all well and good, but again, if you can't make that case, then good luck securing any budget for whatever it is you're trying to procure, right? Only 24% of executives and business leaders can actually explain the value of learning in their organization. That's a bit of a shocking one in and of itself. You know, less than 3/4 of these decision makers actually understands the value of learning in their organization. You know, this is nothing new, to be honest with you. This is something that I face on a daily basis, meeting people who are down in the trenches and they want to change their system. They have all the reasons, but they just can't make the case. And that really brings us back to, I suppose, one of the most important things, which is the questions to ask. Who am I actually selling this ID to? Who holds the purse strings in the first place? And what are you actually trying to fix? You know, it always comes down to what's the actual issue here and what's the benefit of it. So, you know, people, let's say a company of 500 people, they decide we need a new LMS because we're using Excel sheets, and that's a very laborious and time-consuming process. I would always say to someone as well, look, how much time are you actually spending every day doing this? I'm spending 2 hours doing this. What's an hour of your time worth? It's worth, I think the average HR professional is about £20. So if you were to kind of extrapolate that to a company of 10,000 people, it's like, well, you're actually losing this money every day in time, and time is money. So I always look at it in the time aspect when I'm trying to, if I was ever pitching something to anybody, like how much of this time is it actually saving? Okay, so that's always an angle that I would encourage people to take when you're making your business case. Secondly, why do you want to fix it? What's the actual use in doing this? What is the actual cost and the benefit of what it is you're trying to procure? Okay, there are things that are easily quantifiable, as I said, like the actual costs, ongoing costs, and things that are less easy to quantify, such as your time, lower staff morale, lower company reputation, higher turnover, so on and so forth. And as I said, what's in it for them? Tailor that individual pitch to what it is that they're actually looking for, depending on who they are and what they're actually going to be interested in.
And
I was going
to say, one of the things, Michael, which I've noticed as well, is that it's not always about, you know, reduction of, say, headcount, for instance. So the other thing as well is how you can quantify it in these terms. How you realize it, though, it could be something very different. So one of the cases which we come across very recently, the ambition is not to necessarily reduce size in terms of overall costs, but increase the value which the function is able to provide to the business. So by redeploying headcount within an operation from one area which is doing, say, repetitive tasks, into an area which is going to offer genuine value. So I think in this case, we're talking about mindfulness and well-being, and actually putting a really concerted effort behind that and automating a lot of the FAQs through AI. That is a really simple example. To bring in new technology is a great example of, how quantifying it and how it's going to be realized could also be two very different things.
Yeah, I mean, I always think about it like a solicitor making a case to a judge. If you step in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, he's a really nice guy, do you want to let him go? Guilty as charged. But if you make your case, well, I've got signed testimonials, he's a really nice guy, he's done this, he's done that. Presenting evidence and facts and figures is how I look at it. And you'll have a much better time actually securing that procurement or budget or whatever that is. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on it, really.
So one of the other things which we do come across is, depending on industry, every industry will have its own areas which are really important to it. Financial services tend to be more about risk. Service hospitality going to be very much about service and service delivery, making sure that we ensure they get repeat customers back through the doors, whether it be Warwick Castle or a Thomas Tank Engine, Thomas Land down the road for the kids. So their needs are going to be very different. And I think that's also something which is worth stopping in on. And again, it talks back to the point about before, like how are you very clearly identifying your business problem, and then ensuring that you understand your audience, getting that buy-in, and to be able to secure ultimately the budget. And that as a story simplifies things really, really well, I think, in most of the minds of our clients which we work with. Sorry, Mike, you were going to say.
Yeah, no, like a perfect example. You're speaking to a company not too long ago, which treated wood fabrication, 80% blue collar. A big thing for them was being able to turn around health and safety training super quickly, because as you can imagine, lots of forklifts, lots of heavy machinery. I don't want to use the term playing on people's fears, but for an industry like that, a major concern is going to be, well, what happens if somebody's using heavy machinery, they have an accident, now you've got compensation, it's in the news, and there's all these things that could happen. If you had actually perhaps had the right systems in place, the right training, the right culture of learning, and you would have prevented that entirely. That's a sort of a bit of an exaggerated, but it's quite possible, it can happen very easily. But no, you're absolutely right. If it was financial services, you want to look at the risk. What are the implications if people aren't, properly trained in GDPR or whatever it is, or if you're just trying to boost revenue and sales, so Warwick Castle, it's easy to quantify sometimes and less easy sometimes. That would be it really does depend. Your business case will always depend on what industry you work in.
So one of the things which we'll be sending out at the end of this as well as part of that is I'll read out some of the ones which we will send out as part of that, is things like the value of improved data and accuracy, the improvements in compliance and risk management, employee productivity gains, increased efficiency, reduced employee turnover, enhanced decision making through analytics, reduced time to hire, reduced time to competency. So these are really nice, chunky, meaty elements which will be applicable to audiences which sit within the HR space, and then it's a case of making sure that it's far wider applicable to whoever the DMU, decision-making unit, or operation is. Okay, so that brings us really nicely onto presenting the business case and tailoring how you present that to your audience. And one thing which Michael's going to come on, and I invite him along now to jump in if he wants, is something which he's become incredibly well versed at, and it drives for us throughout the organization, but it's something which you see historically with loads of organizations, is introducing things like the one pager. Hi, Michael. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you coming along. the importance of making sure that whatever it is that you're messaging is incredibly succinct. So I'll open the floor to you to sort of quickly chime in on that. And I think that's incredibly important when it comes to packaging whatever it is you've quantified, you've identified, quantified, and then built a business case around.
Yeah, thanks, Dieter, and also thank you, Michael, for joining us today. As you say, I'm all for the one pager. If we can't tell the story to a senior member of a board or a funding finance team, the key messages are why. So what problems have we identified? Why do we think the solution can meet those needs and excel, hopefully above those needs? Then we haven't done our job very well. Anybody can write, a 4 or 5 page presentation, but coming up with a succinctness in style and in format for a single page, which grabs the attention of an executive quickly, that's the key to creating a good business case.
I've got nothing to add. That's absolutely spot on. So I think what was to be a really good time now is to start going into a little bit of a Q&A. So Michael, now we've got you on there. I think, and that's where we would like to spend majority of the time. So we've got a few questions which we've collated from some of our clients, which we've talked to ahead of this. We've also got some questions which have come in whilst the webinar has been going on. One of the ones which I really wanted to sort of start with is, in your experience operating for the years that you have in this space in consultancy, what are the most common blockers when building a business case, would you say?
So I think the two clear ones that I would suggest stand out to me is, one is lack of identifying the business problem. So what are you really trying to fix or resolve or support or create? People often think they've found a problem statement in the early stages of analysis because it stood out. Search is broken, for example. I think it's a great analogy for that in an LMS, where actually it's often lacking data as opposed to being the main problem of the search being broken. So really make sure you've honed down on what the real need is for the business and where the benefit's going to come from to realize. And then second to that, again, similar to the last one, it's around stakeholder buy-in. Have you identified the right stakeholders who can support the investment request, who will stand up in front of a board and explain simply the reason for the investment? And hopefully at the same point also have part of that budget that helps to achieve the investment. So they're the two parts that stand out. Identify the real problem, not the surface problem, and then making sure that you have a senior stakeholders to support your journey.
So from Michael, from a perspective of vendor, I'm sure that's something which you come across quite often. What would you say to that?
Yeah, more than I'd like to see, to be honest. I'm not actually being able to properly identify the problem, because a search function is a perfect example. And not to name names or disparage anybody, but yeah, I've come across people who use several mainstream LMSs, and search bar just doesn't work. And of course, I'm not a tech whiz. I would look at that and say, yes, it's the search bar's problem. But as a matter of fact, it's something in the back end, and the data hasn't actually been collated properly or whatever it is. So something small like that, it might trigger other events. Like, okay, it might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and say, well, now we need to look for another LMS. When in fact, you might not, because you've completely misdiagnosed the problem to begin with. So yeah, I do see that quite a bit.
I think that's a really interesting one, because I think what we tend to find, and Mike, please do chime in here. And we have many conversations internally about this, is about whether or not we're solving the right problems, or we're supporting, or the client is looking to solve the right problems. So what we tend to find is when people come already very far down the process of saying, I want this, one of the jobs which we have, and one of the responsibilities we have as an organization, is to make sure that that is the right problem, and it's going to create the value which they hope it will create. So a lot of the time it's going to take somebody right to the very beginning and recognizing that what they're suggesting they want is actually symptomatic of a bigger issue somewhere else. A really common example of that is looking at technology on its own. So take a technology stack of an institution which is looking at 13 or 14 systems. One place to go and do your holiday booking, another system to go do your payroll details, another system to go and clock your hours, another system to go and find your learning, another system to do your performance appraisals, and it becomes really complicated. So you might be bringing the most amazing or suggesting the most amazing piece of technology, most appropriate for you and for your organization. And it is amazing, but it doesn't land because it hasn't been done. It hasn't been built in the context of the wider organization. And so by proxy, you're actually making the end user's life slightly more complicated by trying to introduce something which is supposed to be making it simpler. So again, Mike, I'll let you chime in on some of these ideas, because I'm sure it's something which you've come across many times in your experience.
Yeah, I think we have, and they're never small. Every company has its own nuances. Yes, there might be a principle of how you approach a situation, but once you start working with each client, you have to become agile in how you look at their investment process or their return on the investment, or skepticism across some of the more executive members who maybe don't add as much merit to learning as a culture, as opposed to just driving numbers. So I think there's a lot of similarities in how you get to the end goal, but the way that each company operates is what makes the business case, I think, an exciting and sometimes frustrating process, especially, again, skepticism and, why invest in learning? If we're struggling in a market, how do we make learning still such an important part? And this comes back down to skills gap, attrition rates. If the market is difficult and you're losing staff because you don't offer incentives of career development, through learning, then you're destabilizing internally as much as you are trying to face into a tough market. So it's about knowing that you still have to invest in the people, whilst you also seek to have external influences and pressures. So it's a balance, and the business case does become, I think, in the last year, more difficult because of that. People do look at the bottom line as opposed to looking at how they maintain what they've got to be able to grow, and that's a footprint of highly skilled individuals driven by a high quality performance system that delivers that at the point of need.
And that comes back to Michael's earlier point around value and making sure that we are talking in terms of value. And actually, that was one of the questions I think we had, which came up in the chat, which is, how do we overcome or address common objections or skepticism from executives who might not necessarily sort of identify the value. So another really common conversation is, how do you link directly the people aspect, and Michael, you touched on that, directly to business impact. And I think some of the most successful business cases which we've seen have made that really simple to be understood, and at very senior levels. So you can kind of see how it becomes a bit of a minefield to be able to do that all on one single page. But a big part of that is identifying the problem, making sure you're connecting that problem to a business impact, and then understanding your audience and making sure that you've got the right audience in the room. One other thing as well, which is also worth mentioning, and mistakes which I've made in the past, I know for sure, is thinking at a very junior level that the decisions all happen in the room at that time, but it doesn't. It's a build-up to the time. By the time you're going into the room to get the thumbs up, the green light, that decision needs to have already been made, and it just being the final step in terms of validating that. So what does that tell you? That tells you about that network and understanding and socializing a lot of these ideas, and actually bringing people on site is so important as part of that process in terms of building your business case.
I mean, it comes back to like what Michael was saying with the one pager. If you can't do it in one page, then you've done it wrong. It needs to be succinct. It needs to be clear. Executives typically don't have, a great deal of time. And, the reality is, without sounding harsh, is that sometimes these people looking for these procurements they're not very high up on this executive's radar. They've got 1,000,001 things to do. You're just another person looking for the purse strings, and you need to be able to quantify that value succinctly and sell it, essentially.
Well, another question which came up in the chat: how do you typically approach defining companies' challenges and needs when planning to implement an LMS? So now we're going to go really specific, talk about HR, L&D specific. And I'll open that one up to you first, Michael, and then we'll go on to you, Mike.
I like to think of the consultant as a doctor. If you break your arm, you go into the doctor's office and he's going to start asking you a bunch of questions. He's not going to say, okay, I see you've broken your arm. I'm going to recommend surgery and it's amazing and it's great and blah, blah, blah. He's going to ask you a heap of questions, and that's what I always try to do. If I'm doing most of the talking, something is wrong. Obviously, understanding what questions to ask. Why are we here? Why are we having this discussion? Well, it's costing me a lot of time, and I'm wasting time, and nobody's actually doing the learning. People aren't engaging with it, so on and so forth. Understanding what the company is about, what's their identity? Is it heavy industry? Are you going to have more blue collar as opposed to white collar? Does the LMS need to be really mobile friendly because people aren't sitting on a computer all day? It totally depends. But it's really just about diagnosing the problem. And I always say to people, if you've got a nail in the wall and I'm holding a screwdriver, I'm not going to pretend it's a hammer, right? Because otherwise, like Mike was saying, what happens is if you do that, you get to the eventual point where it's like, well, we've missed the mark completely. We're not actually adding any value to what you're doing because we did misdiagnose the problem in the first place. And now we spent all this time and energy in the sales process to get to the final hurdle. And it's like, well, no, we're not going anywhere now because we didn't have the right intentions, or we didn't diagnose that issue and add the value properly. So yeah, that would be my experience with it for a very specific application for LMSs. Yeah.
And just out of curiosity, how many times do you get an opportunity to have a bite at the apple? It's not often, is it?
I mean, look, if it were easy, everybody would do it, right? Big ships turn slowly. We deal with construction companies, for example, of about 5,000-7,000 people, and that's just an absolute minefield. We've got the IT department there having a say in it, the head of HR, and you deal with a company of 250 people, and it's much easier. But again, bigger company, bigger apple, more problems, more hoops to jump through. So yeah, it's about just getting it right in that discovery call and really nailing down what is your issue. Can I actually solve it? Do you actually have a problem here? What's the actual value behind what I'm going to do for you potentially? And does it outweigh the costs? That's kind of the short and small of it.
So, Mike, I think one of the things which I think people would love to hear is about your experience in doing reverse brainstorming.
Yeah, I can. Before I do that, I'm going to just one expression that I learned this week from one of our clients in a different country. I think it goes really well what Michael's saying is you can't make a chicken out of a feather. That just made me laugh and stop. So it's spot on. That's like the one pager. You can't make a chicken out of a feather. Just hold that thought.
No, if you're an LMS vendor or if you're a payroll vendor, whatever it is that you are, know what you do and save yourself the time and hassle. Don't try to force a sale if there isn't one there. If you can't help somebody, I always just say, look, I can't do it. I'm happy to recommend you to somebody who can. And you just end up saving everybody time and hassle, really. Yeah. So, yeah, I'd agree with you. Good saying. I'll be using it.
That touches on something which we'll come on to next. I think it's about when we talk about total cost, TCO, total cost of ownership, so lifespan of the product. But before we do that, I think just coming back to that last question which we had, how do you typically approach defining a company's challenges and needs when planning to implement an LMS? Mike, your story about reverse brainstorming, I think could potentially be something which is really useful here.
Yeah, and it's not a methodology which is a vitro home built process for those that have heard of it before. But I guess it looks at the opposite way. So rather than always trying to find the benefits of why you're doing it, reverse your process and go, let's look at how bad we can make it. So what's the worst we could possibly make this process work like? And then that helps you stay away, because we're always trying to find a solution. And finding a solution means you often find the first 3, 4, 5 areas identifiable quite quickly. But if you go, actually, how can we make this worse? There's actually more ways to make it worse than there are to make it better. But once you've listed all those sort of worse ways, then you turn them around. And they become the strong narrative and the storytelling we're talking about how we tell the story about why, if we don't, this is going to be what happens. And that, I think, then leads you on to, that cost of inaction, which I think you're going to come on to next, is if you don't do it, these are the things we're going to see, this degradation of services, degradation of engagement. So that's why we use reverse brainstorming. We do it, as Dieter knows, as a company, on quite a lot of topics. We'll do it on skills. How do you make skills really bad? How do you make learning really bad? How do you make performance really bad? Let's just make it really awful. And then go, right, now let's step back. We've made a great hash of that. Now let's untangle it in the simplest way possible. So it's quite therapeutic, I believe.
It is actually, yeah. A lot goes on the whiteboard. Okay, cool. No, so I think that another really practical way of sort of understanding and defining some of the company challenges we need and needs when planning to implement a new LMS. It also gives you a pretty good idea of the culture and whether or not the culture is actually ready for that level of change. I know there's large volumes of change. We talk about change all the time. We say how exponential it is and how it's always happening, and end users wanting to have a degree of stability. So moving then very quickly on to our second to last subject, which is actually sort of a combination of two. So cost of inactivity is a really important one, and I kind of see that as the below the line number. If we stand still and we do nothing, where's it going to go? So if we were to do a waterfall sort of diagram as to where things are going to go, what's the price of inactivity? And another one which is linked very closely to that is the long-term ROI. So one thing which is also quite valuable, we found in presenting business cases, is looking at the total cost of ownership or total costs involved and when they will deliver value. So if you've got a very short cycle in your organization and your current strategic planning is 6 months and it's midterm at best, then the thing which you're going to be focusing on as a tip is going to be value in year. So that as a focus, I think is also quite useful to have in the back in your toolkit when thinking about business plan. So defining the value and then presenting how you're going to realize that value, again, don't have to be the same thing. It can be two very different things, and the latter being able to apply a timescale around that, again, is also very, very useful. So if your audience is only looking at delivering value in year, perhaps they're under certain cost pressures. Delivering value in year based on a total cost of ownership over a 3-year period or something like that is a valuable way to go about presenting your data. And then when you add in the cost of inactivity, that's a really helpful way to define what that impact is going to be on the business, because then it becomes quite compelling. Total cost of ownership, Mike, I think one of the things which we've spoken about before, one of the things in there which is sometimes overlooked is offboarding. And I don't know if you've got some experience which you'd like to share about offboarding in particular, where you've sort of seen that hasn't necessarily been considered.
Interesting. I think it's not considered by many companies. Unfortunately, I think the idea is back to Michael's point earlier on about, if someone doesn't like the LMS for whatever reason, they tend to then almost like disregard everything that LMS holds, unless they're in a compliance industry, and therefore they obviously are aware that they have to do the data extraction. But if they're not, and they don't have that compliance mindset, then they often think they can just switch off the LMS and they've got a brand new, shiny, amazing experience. And then they realize that his history hasn't been drawn out. So one of the things we do with any client, and we talk about doing a closing of a system and a sunset and then a birth of a new one, is like, okay, which data sets do you want to bring across? So it's almost like it's part of the discussion before the business case gets going. So it's back to that point I think raised earlier about how do you approach defining and challenging moving towards an LMS. It's about starting with that fundamental start, the basics of the data. What data do you want to keep? What training is in flight? What happens to in-flight training? Do you make the persons complete it? So you get your reports in place. I think that's one of the biggest areas that we used to see. I think people or clients now tend to be a little bit more aware of the impact of that. Again, I think that's because compliance has increased as a global need that wasn't there maybe 10 years ago. But that's one of the areas I think clients do get caught out, because that's where typically the sunsetting vendor will be quite expensive. And unless there's a way of exporting that data through a standard route, CSV or something similar, then that cost has to be incurred by the project to extract.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why this is really important is it comes down to the integrity of the function presenting the business case. If you haven't got those, and you do have these costs which appear throughout when it comes to review, it will be something that potentially could prevent you from continuing to build that relationship at your C-suite with the people which are the decision makers, to increase the trust within the operation of HR, L&D, as not just somebody who has a seat at the table, but somebody who has a voice at the table. So considering all of the elements in total cost of ownership, I think is also something which is really important, and we've seen quite a lot over our history in doing this, as not necessarily showing the full picture, and there being surprises along the way, and that potentially hindering the brand reputation of the team which is involved with this. So I think for now we've got a couple more questions, but I think what I'm going to start to look to do is wrap up. So around the room, starting with you, Michael, in terms of summarizing the key takeaways for you from a creation of a business case as a vendor, what would you say were the key quick tidbit pieces you'd leave people with when looking at this or considering this?
Know your audience, know who they are, what they're interested in, what's in it for me, right? Classic question. How it's going to benefit them. Other than that, really, I suppose looking at the value as opposed to cost. Take a look at understand how to quantify value. I always a good time, as I said. If I have an LMS that's causing me issues, how much hours a day, what's the average worth of an hour for this person, so on. I can calculate value based on that. Look at the not so easily quantifiable things like morale, retention, retaining knowledge, company reputation as a result of that and such. And yeah, those who kind of, and also when you're putting together that one pager, be honest, have all of the potential costs in there, long-term and short-term, so that, it's an accurate review at the end of the contract, wherever at the yearly basis, that we know what the ROI is, because you will probably need to make another business case, and you want your executives to see you as somebody who is honest, has all the costs in there. And so, that would be kind of my tidbits for people to take away when making a business case. Grand.
Mike, from you.
I think listening back to what's been said so far, and a bit of a tongue in cheek, but have humor in the process. We talked about, you can't make a chicken out of a feather, and you go to the doctor with a broken arm and they won't give you a broken arm status initially. Just be that critical person in the room. Reverse brainstorm privately if you want to. Make sure that you feel that everything is watertight and secure with, solid foundations of problems, foundations of real cost, and real cost can be effort as well, and destabilization, because there's going to be a period where you have the destabilized learning culture, You're going to have then an adoption and engagement process needed after that for re-engagement, redeployment. People may have gone off learning because of the system, the way that it behaved. So you've got to have a new engagement. You've got to have new content that sits in there, which is incredibly engaging as well. So I think you've got a lot to think about in an LMS business case, but also from the point of view of the ROI, look at the ROI. It won't be straight away. And will it come from learning only? No, it will come from performance as well. It will come from succession. It will come from other strategic demands. So ensure that the LMS and the business case is tied to strategic demands, which may not naturally sit with content and learning as a base. But these are all the key areas that retain people, reduce your attrition rates, therefore reduces your talent acquisition costs as well. So there's a lot of elements in there, which we can unpack. Obviously, people want to speak to us afterwards in different ways, but let's just stick with the chicken and the feather. That's I like that one.
Yeah, I like it too. So no, that's a really nice segue actually to close it out. So one of the things which we're going to be doing, because 45 minutes is a very short period of time to go through and unpack, decades of experience of delivering this from a Vitro perspective and individually what we've done and we've come across. So off the back of this, we will be sending out some resources in there that includes some templates as well from a consultancy perspective, as well as one from Michael in particular, looking at technologies, and ours more broader, looking at learning and development and the impact in that space, specifically some of the subjects which Mike just mentioned around how it is you're able to sort of mobilize strategic workforce management or your talent intelligence and skills-based operation, those kinds of things. So I will leave it there and close out then for the day. So Mike, thank you very much for letting us steal some of your time. I know you're incredibly busy. Michael from Blossom, again, thank you very much for coming along and joining us today to have this conversation in an open space. Like I said, we will be sending out some resources off the back of this, and we hope to continue the conversation online. So we'll leave it there, and thank you very much for everybody who's joined. I hope you guys have a fantastic afternoon.
Thanks, Dieter. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, guys. Take care.